if I could ask the rest of our panel up, Jeremy Bloom from Highways England, Robert Hough from Peel Airports, Warren Marshall, Planning Director of Peel Ports Group, Lynda Shillaw from Manchester Airports Group. Okay. Jonathan, if I could start with you in terms of the sort of the delivery plan, moving on to delivery proper in terms of the execution, how easy is it going to be to get to that next step and start seeing some of these corridors actually built out?
So the aim will be over the next 9 months, Paul, as we develop the final version of the transport plan for next summer. Each of those 9 corridors that you will see will have its sort of program level business case for investment. And that kind of picks up, I think, what we talked about this afternoon and the question before. This is why it's different. This is the North saying, this is the totality of our need. So this is the kind of Crossrail 2 argument across the whole of the North. But based around real investment, real numbers of homes that it delivers, and real aspirations in those sort of corridors. So over the next 9 months, we will do that working with our partners. And we will need businesses, a lot of people in this room, to step up and give us that evidence. So I generally say, give me the bullets and I will fire them over the next 9 months.
Okay. How does that take shape? Where do they go? Do they contact you? Is there a website? What if people want to leave today and say, I've got an economic case for my business growing through those corridors?
So feel free to contact Transport for the North, and there's contact details on the back of the position statement and in the pack, and there's a sort of general strategy sort of website address. But on each of the corridors, we're looking to set up a small steering group of our partners and a business reference group on each of those corridors, which will keep us honest and give us those bullets. So if you want to get involved, that's the thing to do, because I think the guts of it and the exciting thing about the corridors is that's where the transport plan really comes to life, because that's where we understand what we all really need. And what we need is sort of 9 of those very clear, collective, cohesive, consistent voices going forward. So please feel free to help as much as you can.
And Warren, at Peel Ports, you've heard a lot today about the sort of plans, the strategy. How are you finding that sort of actually takes shape on the ground? And tell us a bit about what you're working on.
Yeah, I think I was sort of reflecting on today's session yesterday afternoon, and I started at Peel Ports 10 years ago, and for those that were still around 10 years ago, there was something called the Eddington Transport Study, and that was all about international connectivity. We've had Transport Select Committee inquiries, we've had High Speed North, National Infrastructure Commission, Transport for the North, which we're huge supporters of, but I think our issue is, I think we all know what needs to be done. It's the sort of the acceleration. I mean, international connectivity hasn't gone away. Arguably, it's a lot more challenging now than it was 10 years ago. So all we can do as Peel Ports, and we're in the final throes of finishing off a £750 million investment in our infrastructure. So Port of Liverpool, Manchester Ship Canal and Hough, and that's really about preparing the port for the future. A couple of big projects, the 2 or 3 which I'll mention quickly. Liverpool 2 is our deep sea container terminal. Liam mentioned earlier that 90% of deep sea imported containers come through the southeast, and of the 90%, 60% are trying to get anywhere north of Birmingham. So that places a lot of pressure on strategic road and rail corridors. So we're trying to redress the balance by investing £400 million in a deep sea container terminal, which puts us alongside Southampton, Felixstowe and London Gateway. So we're sort of going after some of that 90%, if there's anybody with any southern port interest in the room. The other case study, and again we've now finished this project, a £100 million biomass import terminal. And this is a good news story for North, because it's Drax Power Station who've converted half of their facility at Selby from coal to renewable fuel. And 3 of the northern ports, so Humber Ports, the Port of Tyne and Liverpool, are all part of that supply chain. So, and then the final one is Port Salford, which is an inland multimodal logistics hub. The more freight that we handle here into the north of the country, the more pressure that places on the logistics and the property market in particular. So there's a big demand around land release and issues around planning, strategies, etc. But I think around all of what I've explained, our main ask, and it's stating the blindingly obvious, is to sort out, for Transport for the North, for the government, DFT, to sort out what is very antiquated northern transport infrastructure.
And in terms of the roads part in linking into the ports and helping get freight off the roads coming out of Liverpool, Hough, etc. Jeremy, tell us how the plans are coming forward for road rail.
Well, I mean, generally, we are prioritising our investment for the current roads period. So as the Minister said earlier, we're spending almost £3 billion over the next few years improving the strategic road network in the north through transformative projects. Many of those are about improving access to ports in particular. So we have planned investment over the next few years to improve access to the Port of Liverpool. We are formally opening an £88 million improvement to the road to Immingham this Friday. So we're getting tangible results already from our investment. But in the longer term, we're also planning for our next road investment period from 2020 to 2025, where we're looking at the investment plan for that period, where we're developing solutions jointly with colleagues in Transport for the North, for example, and across the country, but particularly in the North, we're working on a number of studies. John Cridland mentioned the Transpennine Tunnel, which is one of our key priorities to connect Manchester and Sheffield much better. And also the other key priority for us is the M60, so the northwest of Manchester, which I think is probably the most congested pinch point on the network. And to unlock that will transform travel across the north and help to support the growth of Port of Liverpool, Hull and beyond. So we have some really ambitious plans, and working with government, working with Transport for the North, I think there are real reasons for optimism that we can play our part in transforming the transport network in the north.
And from the airport's point of view, Lynda, perhaps start with you. Tell us how you see the sort of strategic role of airports in the wider context.
I suppose really at the highest level, and that's not an airport pun, airports in any regions that they're located are massive economic drivers, both in terms of from an employment perspective, but also in terms of access to international markets. And if you look at Manchester Airport, we had another record year last year. We had 26 million passengers through the door. We've actually got capacity for up to 55 million. We've got 2 runways at Manchester. And whilst we're only the 3rd largest airport in the UK, we're just inside the top 20 in terms of size in Europe. But actually, really importantly, globally, we're in the top 15 when we look at destinations served. So as airports go sitting outside of London, Manchester is a bit of a gem. And it's absolutely fundamental to the success of what we're talking about. So from a Northern Powerhouse perspective, it is the gateway to the rest of the world. Every new long-haul route that we put on will bring in, the estimates range for anything from 130 to 200 million pounds a year to the local economy, whether it's tourism, whether it's education, whether it's sort of investments in infrastructure. And you see a lot of that in the property sector in the UK in terms of some of the routes that we've put on and the destinations that we serve. So I think really fundamentally what drives our confidence as a business to invest not just in a billion in the transformation of the airport, sort of taking it right into the 21st century and increasing the amount of infrastructure that we have to serve passengers and airlines. But also alongside that, you've got, sort of 800 to £1 billion of investment in what's the southern growth node of the city, in Airport City. So, it's absolutely fundamental to the debate, and actually not divorcing aviation strategy from surface access strategy is really important. And I know in terms of the way this day has gone so far, all the talk about high speed 2 and high speed 3, the airport is a major node, and it has to be looked at in that way. I think it was John who said earlier that if we can increase the speed and the connectivity between cities, you can open up the catchment to, say, 10 million people who could access, sort of the Manchester and the airport. That is phenomenal in terms of what you can do from an international route perspective. That's another 20 to 30 routes that actually potentially serve us and actually open us up even further across the world.
And Robert, from Peel and Peel Airport's point of view, obviously Peel very good at seeing the opportunity, seeing where the demand is. How are your airports performing, and how do you see the sort of demand pressures at the moment?
Yeah, well, they've had a very good year last year. I think Liverpool particularly showing double-digit growth, as indeed Manchester did. So two airports 35 miles away performing well, and that's competition for us both, and therefore good news for the passenger and the traveller. It's fair to say, I think, that the aviation industry is hitting now stronger headwinds. It's affected by probably reduced disposable spend, the impact of Brexit, uncertainty about European airlines, how they see the UK. They report in euros in the case of Wizz, and particularly Ryanair, and therefore the UK becomes less attractive. But we see another growth of 7 or 8% in passenger numbers to about 5.1 million passengers this coming year. And the point that Lynda made about the extraordinary contribution airports make, we are £35 million turnover business in Liverpool, and our GVA contribution is £250 million, and we support jobs of 6,000. So the impact that's made is extraordinary. What struck me earlier was the concentration on road and rail. And I do think understanding the importance of ports and airports is equally important. I'm sure they're in people's mindsets, but I do think that's a point I would just like to make in that context. And I think, secondly, who's looking at the really big picture? In airports particularly, there hasn't been a national aviation strategy for some years. One is promised later this year. We'll wait and see about that. But in the north, I asked this question in a rhetorical fashion. Is it right that Manchester Airport is the airport for the north? That's a question to be addressed. Should that growth be spread around the north more evenly, and therefore east of the Pennines get their share? The concentration of traffic on the S62 is enormous. And we have an airport in Doncaster Sheffield Airport, and 1.3 million passengers, can handle 25 million passengers within our vision with an East Coast mainline connection. But these big picture situations need to be considered. And also, I think the point made by John before very fairly around Crossrail North and Crossrail 2 in London, and he's quite right, it's not our turn, that's not the argument, it has to be a convincing argument we can make stick. But that should really work. The disparity of spend between London, the South East and the North really is quite shameful. But we have to bring the projects forward to justify that spend. And therefore, we should press for Crossrail North. It should be an open door we're pressing at, really. And that's my message today. Let's go for that and make it happen. East-West, Transpennine.
Okay, and whose role is it to call for that? Is it down to the new city region mayors? Is it down to business? Is it down to Transport for the North? Where does where do we target the lobbying in all this?
I think it's everybody, and I think, like I suspect most of this panel, we all sat here 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, probably having very similar debates. I certainly did the last time I worked in Manchester 10 years ago. So I think there is a point here that actually what we now have is an infrastructure and a framework that I think actually has some momentum, because actually it is in not just this government's interest, but the next government's interest and the government after that to try and rebalance the economy in the UK. And everything that we're talking about today is actually pretty fundamental to making that happen. But it won't happen if you just have, sort of a number of, of groups, whether it's north-wide or, that are independent of business, that are independent of the mayors and the cities. It will not happen. So I think it's actually incumbent on every single one of us to get behind these guys and actually try to, and help them to have the evidence base to make the case, and just don't shut up about it. Don't sit here another decade. I commute from Leeds to the airport every day. I can tell you it's not fun. On the train. I mean, I gave up driving it, so don't sit here in another decade saying, actually, let's try and do this. I think we are on the cusp of being able to not only make the case, I think that's been done, but actually secure the funding to start to deliver that.
Warren, you want to come back in?
One of the agencies we all need to work with is the National Infrastructure Commission. So they published a report last year called High Speed North, which is a bit of a contradiction, I suspect, but I don't think that was the reason why it was called High Speed North. It was an aspirational title. But to be fair to Lord Adonis and his team, they've been brought in to act in an apolitical way to advise government which transcends different parliamentary periods. So they published the report, and the upshot of that report was basically there needs to be an accelerated delivery of transport investment in the north. So not trying to keep up with the south, almost to catch up and overtake, because there's been so much underinvestment over many decades.
Robert, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would say this, it's nobody, but everybody. There's not a clear path there, and there should be a clear path. I mean, we have competing interests probably around the Highways Agency, Network Rail, National Infrastructure Commission, the LEPs, business. But if somebody said to me, what is the route to progress? I can't answer that question. There isn't a clear route. There should be a clear route to aim with a clear path as to how to deliver that objective. We don't have that, but I do think probably the key player is the NIC.
And do you think that that could have been Transport for the North? It sounds like it
I don't think necessarily Transport for the North has that role, if I has to say. That probably has a different dimension. It's done a great job. I think the IER document, one of those foundation documents which will be with us for decades in terms of its authority and knowledge. But I don't think it is there. I think it's higher up the scale than that. And I think they're part of the argument, part of the promotion, but the decision-making process lies differently. It's who that lies with. It is unclear. And therefore, the path for arguing the case, promoting the case, has to be clarified, and I think it does come with NIC. Otherwise, it becomes a confused story. We're all piling in with our arguments, but there's no direct path to the conclusion.
Andrew Adonis was on the radio this morning talking about reminding government that the Heathrow runway expansion was still planned, and it's not all about Brexit, and maybe the civil servants need to, and the ministers need to look at the workings of government and not just be caught up on the sort of chaos of the political landscape. I mean, is there a fear amongst yourselves on the panel that we will go through a very distracting period now, 6 months, a year, or what have you? Yeah, Jeremy.
I don't see that. I think there's increasing importance in investing in infrastructure, and certainly on the highway side. Yes, there may be some transitional turbulence, obviously change of government and settling down, but we're seeing real commitment to investing in infrastructure across the board. I think Transport for North do have a key role. Investing in major new road building is always going to be very sensitive, controversial, complex and very challenging. And one of the challenges we face is building a sufficient consensus to take big transformational schemes forward, because there'll always be voices for and against. I think where Transport for the North really help us in taking big schemes like, say, Trans-Pennine Tunnel forward is being able to create that single voice for the North, and I think that's very powerful.
Jonathan, have you found it any harder to get meetings in the diary with your counterparts at Department for Transport, given the turmoil that government's been in?
I think it's actually easier. Because I think as Jeremy kind of alluded to, I think even in terms of uncertainty, actually investing in infrastructure, economic infrastructure, is a very obvious thing to do. So I think it's easier. Just picking up the point before, Paul, I think it is a collective voice. I think it's everybody in this room's job to promote what is needed, sort of thing. So it's interesting because we talked a bit today about Crossrail 2, sort of thing. So if you actually wind the clock back, as a scheme, Crossrail had a relatively weak transport BCR because it was quite an expensive scheme, sort of thing. It was when London First, as a group of businesses, got together. It was when they talked about the wider economic impacts of regeneration, and they had several London boroughs saying, this is the placemaking we can do around the Crossrail stations. That was when it really moved from a transport project to a transformational economic project. And that was pitched very, very firmly at Treasury, not the Department for Transport. So we talked this morning about Treasury being sort of a common enemy, if you like. My view is that the way Treasury assesses sort of benefits is applied differently in different government departments. I think actually this is about saying to Treasury, this is a new way of assessing long-term programme level business cases, not individual scheme business cases. So we're not fighting amongst each other on those corridors. Everybody in that corridor is saying, over the next 20 years, here's what we need to do, and here's the outcomes. And we don't get into these individual little spats about what this scheme does or what that scheme does or what the BCR this is. It is saying it's 10,000 new jobs, it's £1 billion of private sector investment, and it's 20,000 new homes, because those numbers resonate with government. And that's what we need to do. We need to make those sort of cases.
Jeremy?
I think Jonathan's absolutely right. And it's about having a longer-term strategy. So part of the problem with the approach that Hough England or maybe Network Rail or that everybody, local authorities have taken in the past, is very piecemeal, project-by-project approach. By having a strategic approach, then it's not about which is the next scheme off the blocks. It's about the overall strategy that's being followed in a particular corridor, and it needs to be multimodal, it needs to be integrated. So I think Jonathan's absolutely right. I think that is a step change. It is potentially a really transformative approach.
My point, Paul, was not to deny the need for a collective voice, quite clearly. That is vital. It was to understand that the progress one has to go down to actually deliver the result. And that's a slightly different question, I think. And that was the point I was seeking to make.
Yeah. And talking about the changing political and therefore economic pressures, from sitting at the port of Liverpool and looking out onto the Irish Sea, it could be that there's a power shift round there coming from Ireland with the border, but also DUP, Northern Ireland, if they get an influx of infrastructure investment as part of any deal there. Is that something that you're calculating at the moment and weighing up how you respond?
Absolutely. Part of our investment in Liverpool too is effectively the springboard to the Republic of Ireland and also to Northern Ireland, because 90% of those containers that I mentioned from the south, quite a decent proportion of those are trying to get across the Irish Sea. So the Irish Sea, geographically, is absolutely our sweet spot in terms of a lot of the supply chains into the Republic and to Northern Ireland are dependent upon the mainland here. So we're very switched on with what's going on in Ireland, both politically and also in the Republic. The other thing, and I need to give Hough a bit of a plug here, and I quote this as probably, I can't think of a transport project that's taken longer to sort out than the Hough Link Road. It was first talked out in 1948. I wasn't involved back then, I hasten to add, but positively, Lancashire County Council have realised the importance of that link road to Hough, and in turn, the Port of Larne in Northern Ireland, they've also got a road connection. So, you know, Lynda's right, the ports and the airports are only as good as having good road and rail connectivity, and also coastal shipping in the case of the Irish Sea. But right, in terms of Brexit and what that may mean positively or negatively, Ireland is critical to our business planning going forward.
And Lynda, has that has the sort of European question, if you like, has that impacted on your plans? There's a £1 billion transformation programme at the airport. Obviously, a lot depends on retail, consumer confidence, these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think there are very few businesses that would sit here and say it's not impacting on their thinking or their plans. I mean, I think that is just, you know, sort of where we are at the moment. That said, you know, sort of businesses like us, you know, we're a long-term business, in the region. Our investors take a long-term view. And certainly I was in London last week talking to quite a number of investors, mainly in the property sector, and that was very much, you know, sort of the message that was coming back, that whilst investors may be pausing and evaluating the long-term view and the attractiveness of the UK as a place to invest, you know, sort of still held good. I think you then get into just making sure you can actually sort of manage your risks and prioritise the right thing as you go through. I mean, it's not like we're going to do it all in a year. It's a 10-year programme. It's like Airport City is a sort of 12 to 15-year programme. So these things are going to come forward as we go through Brexit. I just think to pick up on the point about, you know, sort of maintaining the momentum, you know, in terms of securing investment in transport and infrastructure, I think actually that is the thing we've got to be relentless on. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the devolution agenda or city mayors in that. They're going to have a very loud voice actually representing the regions and the economies that, that they sit in making sure that this remains right on the government agenda and that the government effectively are held to delivering some of the promises that they've made around rebalancing the UK economy. So, I think everybody's in the same boat with Brexit, but stopping doesn't seem like a sensible thing to do to me. We just got to go on with it.
Quite. Robert?
Yeah, just on warrants, it was too sort of discreet, not to mention the A5036, which is the great task of Liverpool, which is the connection into the port of Liverpool from the motorway M57 there. But in terms of Brexit, we have found, certainly Lynda, I don't know whether Manchester has found, but Ryanair will always react very energetically to new situations, and therefore they will say that, for example, they've had open skies pre-Brexit. Post-Brexit, there could be need for bilateral agreements, and therefore the UK doesn't seem as attractive. That is a real issue, and they chip away at airports in terms of using that as a bargaining tool. We have seen that, and Wizz, to a lesser extent, another big Polish airline flying to the UK and our airports, have had the same position. We've not seen any lack of reduced investor appetite, but certainly airline response has been marked, and they don't miss a trick in order to reposition themselves commercially.
But I think if you again pull it up to, sort of the government and the group that is actually negotiating with the rest of Europe, open skies and the need to maintain open skies for the benefit of Europe, because it isn't just the UK that has benefited from open skies, it is the whole of Europe, is actually sort of very firmly one of the agenda items that all major sort of airports, airlines, and actually sort of trade bodies and trade departments have actually sort of made sure is actually in the mix of what's being negotiated. So I think everybody's at one on pushing to maintain open skies.
Okay, any questions from the floor? Just, one over on the side there.
Chris Jackson from the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. How do we overcome the prophets of doom in the National Audit Office who continue to tell us that major infrastructure projects are extremely expensive, are badly managed and full of risk?
Anybody?
Well, they're definitely the first normally and the last. And the skill in making sure that they come in at the right price on the right time and actually deliver the value that supports the business case is actually getting the management bit right. I think there's a serious point here, and again it goes to skills. When you look at the number of major infrastructure projects that are going to be delivered within the UK, let alone within this region, we know we have, it's the point that John was making earlier, a real sort of skills shortage, within not just the UK, but actually, like I say, regions where you've got a lot of construction activity going on, particularly major infrastructure. And actually one of the other sort of challenges then is making sure you can actually get the right skilled workforce to deliver it. But they are always expensive and they are always full of risk.
Jeremy?
And organisations like Highways England and Network Rail need to really build their reputation for delivery. Highways England's worked very hard over the last few years as the agency and now as Highways England to delivering major projects, and we do have reasonably good reputation for delivering on time and to budget and managing those risks. And the benefits of the infrastructure, yes, they're expensive, but on average, for every pound we invest, we're seeing economic return of £3. So we're making the case to National Audit Office and to everyone else that will listen for investment, certainly in the strategic road network, and I think we're demonstrating our ability to manage those risks and to deliver. So, but I think it's across the whole industry. We need to work together to demonstrate that it is worth investing in infrastructure, because, as Jonathan said earlier, the economic prize is such that it's worth investing.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Just to add to that, I think it comes back down again to kind of beating yourself up, doesn't it? That you never hear about NAO reports that say this went really well. You only hear about the ones that went really badly. A lot of the people sat on this stage and in this room have been involved in infrastructure projects that have been delivered very, very well to time and to budget. So it's beholden about saying, well, actually, we can do this. There is a momentum we need to build up on this, Chris. And it is a classic case of you never hear stuff that goes really well, do you? You only hear about stuff that goes badly.
I hope the Mersey Gateway scheme, which opens fourth quarter of this year, £650 million, will fall into that category, Jonathan. I believe it will. Fantastic.
And Ortal Cord as well. You know, those sort of, you never hear about, you know, threading that railway through the centre of Manchester. You never hear about it. And that's good because it hasn't caused a problem. It's gone really well and it will deliver real benefits. Direct access to the airport.
Okay, question from the floor.
Hi, Neil Anderson from Amy. I'm very interested in some of the things that you've been saying, and particularly picking up the point that you've made, Jonathan, about a very different approach to appraisal at a programme level and a scheme level. However, I think a lot of this stuff will depend on the local connectivity, the last mile. And I just wonder if perhaps in terms of, again, a term you used, Jonathan, which is sequencing, whether we should be using sequencing as part of the process by which we encourage people to tackle at a local level through the local planning this last mile to make sure that we actually gain the economic benefits that we project at the higher level.
I would wholeheartedly agree on that one. I think so. Again, you know, we're amongst friends. We have seen, you know, department officials kind of like hunch their shoulders when I talk about this is not about budgets. This is about need. When things need to happen to unlock some of the significant investment that some of the people on this stage are going to make. And I think that applies both across some of the pan-northern corridors and at local level. So when are things needed? We're too driven, and Jeremy and colleagues are restrained and constrained by the way the world works. We're too driven by that sort of stop, start, you know, restrained, you know, spending review periods. This is about a transformational project for the economy in the north. It's when are things needed. And I think that then leads you to this sequencing argument. And if we apply that across the board, both on some of the pan-northern corridors and within city regions, which are just as important to deliver that overall economic growth, because people will need to move into the centres of city region as well as around the north of England as well, then I think we really do then start to win this argument of why we're doing something differently. And that in itself is not the sort of, you know, oh, the South had this is what we want. This is a case of saying, this is the North doing something very, very different for the North. So it's by the North, for the North.
Warren. Oh, sorry.
Well, just on the last mile point, really quite an interesting subject, and it is rapidly moving up the agenda. Highways England, one of the transformations that have taken place in my organisation since it moved from being an agency to a government company is we're becoming increasingly customer focused, which is a very positive thing indeed. I'm sure people will agree. And of course, when people are making a journey, whether passengers or freight, and they're travelling to an airport or a port, we can invest in the strategic road network, but actually it's the whole journey right up to the gate of the port or the airport that's important. And we are thinking very, very carefully now about that whole journey. And I know in discussions with the department recently, they're thinking about it as well. And I think in the next roads investment strategy from 2020, I think there will be more of an emphasis on that last mile, and for Highways England to be thinking much more about that element of the journey.
Okay,
So just on the last mile connectivity, both Jeremy and Robert have teamed me up beautifully here. We're active with Network Rail on the Bootle branch line, which is £8 million, quite a modest sum of money in terms of national rail spending, but positively that will give us the rail freight capability from the port, at least the West Coast main line, and then you're into the wider discussions we've had today. So rail's not in bad shape in terms of the Port of Liverpool. The road connection, which is Dunwich Bridge Road, is heavily constrained in terms of it serves many different purposes, not least it's the main commute route into Liverpool. Positively, the DfT and Highways England have two solutions on the table. Certain stakeholders don't believe either solution is ambitious enough, but we're going to keep campaigning through the new roads minister that we've met today, through Highways England, Transport for the North, Combined Authority. There's a role here for the Metro Mayor, Steve Rotherham, that's recently been elected. So we're going to sort of keep at it, keep plugging away. My frustration is a lot of the final mile gets caught up in local issues. We're an international gateway, and I think we feel road and rail connectivity requires an international thought process rather than whether it should be improving the existing road or building a new one. So I've just got to be a bit careful what I say in this forum.
I think it needs both though actually, because if you look at Airport City South where Amazon sort of opened last year, I mean one of the planning conditions, you know, was actually around how a proper transport plan which we worked with, you know, sort of the city, you know, the local district, highways authorities to actually get something that works. So if you can't, if your public transport isn't serving the last mile, how do you get, you know, significant numbers of people in two shift patterns to, whether it's the transport interchange at the train station or how many need to come by car, then how do you start to move them around? And Amazon actually run coaches around the conurbation or buses around the conurbation bringing people in. You know, they were up to 2,000 people on site last year. So you've got to actually address the local dialogue is incredibly important when you're actually bringing these major schemes of developments forward. And you've got to make it work because you know, that is part of opening the jobs up to the widest possible catchment as well.
Just on Doncaster Sheffield Airport, Paul, that's having its last mile built as we speak. It was started last Friday from the M18 just south of Sheffield, back right into Doncaster Sheffield Airport, again addressing that very point successfully. A private public sector partnership to which Peel's contributed about £15 million out of a £70 million scheme, but it is taking you right into the heart of the ultimate destination.
I think the airport put something like 30 million into the transport interchange in terms of the new platform. You know, so you've got to do it at both ends. I think you've got to have the local end engaged as well.
Absolutely.
And in terms of the land needed for some of these projects, whether it's the warehousing or new stations, new roads, how do we ensure that the land is reserved that matches the Transport for the North plan and the aspirations? Is that down to local authorities, combined authorities, or should there be some sort of regional spatial framework?
Well, I think just taking Liverpool, in fact, it's probably going to announce this week, Liverpool Airport, its own master plan up to 2037, 8 million passengers, and will envisage development on the south side of the airfield into currently a greenbelt area for distribution and employment land. So that's very much coming forward to the local authority, and it will go through a process of scrutiny and appeal, but driven forward by that. In Doncaster Sheffield, we own 1,600 acres of land there, Peel, of which about 800 comprise the airfield itself. The balance comprises development opportunity. That's the same size, Lynda, in fact, as Manchester's footprint. So that is the potential for the next 40 years in Yorkshire, counterbalancing the strength and the huge importance of Manchester, west of the Pennines, part of the Northern Powerhouse, part of rebalancing the nation. But that is land we have in our ownership within Peel for the next 30 years at Doncaster, 1,600 acres in total.
Warren, come in.
Yeah, I think what I mentioned before, the more freight into the region, whether it's sea freight or air freight as well, the more pressure there'll be need on logistics, space and distribution. You only have to see what's being built at Omega in Warrington. You know, it's sort of like Phoenix from the flames. I think at the last count there's about 6 or 7 logistics warehouses on the M62 corridor. In my planning world, ambition and planning policy varies massively from one local authority to another. I can't mention local authorities, but what I will say is the local authorities that will benefit in terms of jobs and inward investment and reducing disparity are those local authorities that are bold with their planning strategies. So Robert's mentioned the Liverpool City region. They've done a freight and logistics study, as have Greater Manchester, and they've both revealed a massive shortfall in land and premises around the freight sector. So it's really going to be down to the elected, you know, the politicians and the officers of the local authorities. I don't know, to be bold. Some will be more bold than others. You know, not everybody wants to be part of releasing the green belts, but equally, some authorities are willing to make difficult decisions on the planning strategies.
What we found, Paul, if I might just say, is a hugely proactive and positive approach to grand schemes, impressive schemes, delivering growth opportunity for the future. And they listen, they respond, and they come on board. So I've got nothing but admiration for local authorities and the way they respond to these exceptional opportunities and plans for the future.
Okay, and in terms of delivery, Warren, you've been very modest and not mentioned the hundreds of millions of pounds that's gone into Liverpool too. which has opened in the last 12 months, trying to do that sort of moving the containerisation round to the north. But it does seem to have been quite quiet in terms of the announcements of new services using that. Is that down to a property issue that there isn't
No. I mean, I think, bear in mind, these big infrastructure investments are decades in the making. So Liverpool 2 was thought back as long ago as 2003, 2004. The Harbour Revision Order was confirmed in 2007. Then we had the recession. I mean, positively, our shareholders made the decision 4 or 5 years ago to invest heavily in deep-sea container capacity in Liverpool, because if we would have decided not to invest, we would have woken up one day and realised there's no more containers into Liverpool. So our business development team are active at the moment. We've got territorial salespeople around different parts of the globe, in particular the Far East and the Americas, working with shipping lines, working with consumers and manufacturers. We've launched a Cargo 200 initiative. We've now got 210 signatories. We're part of a supply chain. So companies like Matalan, B&M Bargains, Home and Bargain, JCB, Jaguar Land Rover, we're getting to the heart of manufacturing and consumerism here in northern Britain, because our facility at Liverpool is not just for the northwest, it's for the north, it's a national asset as well. So we're working with customers and we're also working with shipping lines, and if we can get a critical mass of containers to fill a post-Panamax container ship, then we will have deep-sea container vessels directly calling into Liverpool rather than the southeast of England.
And Jeremy, doesn't there seem to be a bit of a paradox that there's that economic argument for the containerisation, there's the jobs, etc., and the growth of the Port of Liverpool, but Dunningsbridge Road is still congested and it's still sharing space with commuters, and yet we can build a £500 million bridge across the Mersey.
Well, one of our priority schemes for the current road period is an improvement, potentially a new road. We've got a couple of options we're developing at the moment, but we are seeking to improve access to the port for that very reason, working in partnership with Warren's team to improve access so that the benefit of that private sector investment can be realised. So we are doing, but I think as Warren said, it's really important to recognise that although that's a road that's going in locally, that it's going to have much wider benefits to the whole region, and we need the region to be speaking with one voice to support that investment.
But I think, in the two examples or answers you've both given, the nub of it is both of these things actually take a long time to deliver. So it's not a surprise when it actually comes. So actually the importance is about making sure that we synchronise the planning of the infrastructure with actually the opening up and the development of the land. Because, the lead time on what you're describing, it's the same for any major project. You're 7 years before you put a spade in the ground. So, we should actually be better at joining that up.
I do, if I might say, I do think that the argument in favour of that scheme is just so obvious. It's manifestly powerful in terms of its benefit to both the port and to the local economy. And it can at times be, and I choose my words carefully, parochialism, which doesn't prevent that from happening more swiftly. This has been around for 5 or 6 years, at least now, in this current state. That port has been open for a year in November. And it is clogging up traffic for all concerned. So slicing through that is needed. And I think it is, it's time it was sorted, because there have been so many beneficiaries, but the local arguments can override at times the bigger need.
Okay. That's a good point to finish it on, and here to that. We need to get that sorted. If you join me in thanking our panellists today. Thank you.